My name is Ryan Harpin. This is FTH 223 Hammer Fire Pistol Course, and this is assignment number 4. Today's date is September 7th of 2025. For our assignment today, it's going to be a 3-part assignment. In part 1, we'll cover compensator science. In part 2, we'll cover stoning and polishing. Encompassed in that is going to be obtaining some trigger pull measurements, disassembling the firearm, stoning and polishing some certain surfaces, and then reassembling, getting additional trigger measurements, and then replacing the springs, and then getting some additional trigger pull measurements. And then part 3, we're going to assess the ability to do that job. So first things first, as always, we've got a live firearm in the workspace. We need to make sure that it is clear and free of any ammunition. So first things first, we don't have a feed source in. Got empty feed sources here and no live ammunition in the workspace. So we're going to visually and physically inspect the firearm. Rack it several times to make sure it's still empty. Visually and physically inspect it again. And we have a safe workspace for our assignment. So on to part 1, which is going to be our compensator science. So the big part is addressing the science behind a compensator and why they work and how they help. So compensators work by redirecting gas to apply downward force as the projectile leaves the barrel. Some of them also include expansion chambers and baffles, which keep that forward momentum on the slide to also reduce felt recoil. So some of the pros are, again, they reduce felt recoil, they reduce muzzle rise, which allows for faster follow-on shots and faster sight acquisition. And for compensators that are directly attached to threaded barrels, by having a threaded barrel, you get a barrel that extends beyond the normal length of the barrel, which allows for the projectile to spend more time in the barrel, burn up more of that gunpowder, and gain velocity. Some of the cons is that it may change the function of the firearm. You're adding weight to the front end of the firearm. This could require multiple parts to be replaced, machined, weight reduction, things like that. Another con, disassembly is going to require additional steps, more so than it did before, and it may not be possible in the field without specialty tools. And then, as I've already said, you're adding weight to a firearm, which is, of course, going to alter the recoil.
We're back after getting our first trigger weight measurements, and I chose to use my Lyman gauge for that instead of the electronic one, especially since I was doing single and double action. In single action, I got 4.5 pounds, 4.75 pounds, 4.5 pounds, 4.25 pounds, and 5 pounds for an average weight of 4.8 pounds. In double action, I got 11.5, 11 and a quarter, 10.75, 10.5, and 10.25 for an average weight of 10.85 pounds. Now to assess the feel of the trigger pull on this firearm. And again, we're going to verify that the weapon is clear, free of any ammunition, no feed source, and nothing's in the chamber, both visually and physically checked. So the trigger on this SAR B6 is sticky and gritty, to say the least. In single action, it's really not too terrible, but when we're talking about double action, we get a lot of stick, a lot of pushback into the finger. In single action, before we hit the wall, we kind of get to some type of grit with it. It's gritty all in this action, and I'm hoping smoothing out the metal will take care of that. So we're going to go ahead and disassemble this, and we're going to work on smoothing out some of those materials. We'll use a combination of stones, probably the Dremel tool you see behind us, to look for those surfaces that are marring or making contact and see what we can do to smooth those surfaces out. Okay, so we've stoned some parts to get them prepared. So we took out some of these high spots that aren't really moving, but if I can get it in focus, just to allow for some better fit. Hit it with some die cam, ran a cycle a bunch of times. We can see that that's still making contact. We may polish them with the Dremel tool. On the sear, if I can get the sear into focus. So we did some polishing here just with a light stonework to smooth this out if it stays in focus. So we can see we got it to a point with very even wear. There's still a little slight high spot on this side of the sear. So right here, so might do some light work, a little more stoning right there. On the hammer, or sorry, that was the hammer sear surfaces. On the actual sear, we can see a very good uniform removal of the die chem that completely aligns with that locking sear surface. So that right there is going to be where we're going to leave it. We're not going to alter that anymore. I'll probably put some phospho blue on there just to preserve that surface, but going to hit this a little bit more with some polishing to just smooth out that sear surface. And then another area where we were making contact with the side of the frame which I smoothed out just using a stone, and now we're not making contact anymore. You can still see the light-colored metal under there. Right there, hit that with some Dicam blue. We're still not a completely smooth surface up here, so do a little more stonework up here where it's making contact with the frame. I want to see complete coverage instead of just partial. And then over here on this side of the trigger, we can see we still have some raised portion over here, as well as here compared to that center portion. A little bit of ununiform rub on the opposite side of the trigger too, so we're going to smooth that out. And then one area that we're seeing a lot of interaction, which it's designed to have interaction, but I want to smooth out, is we're going to take the magazine release out and smooth that out too. Alright, so we're done with our final polish after using some Dicam and running functions checks and getting it all smoothed out. So we chose to stone most areas. Some areas, like up here, I did use the Dremel tool to get a final polish along with the side of the trigger. These are areas where I was having contact with the surfaces. We've cleaned everything off to make sure we have no Dicam, no polishing compound. Missed one spot right there. Make sure we have no Dicam or no polishing compound. And the next step before reassembly and getting a trigger measurement on the hammer or on this firearm is we are going to use some Oxbow blue to seal these parts off and add a layer of corrosion protection. So we'll get that done, reassemble the firearm, and reassess the trigger. So we finished the polishing of the trigger components and some of the other moving components inside the firearm. Again, visually and physically inspect that chamber, make sure there's nothing in that magazine well. And we've also done some weight measurements. So after polishing everything, re-bluing it, we came up with a average single action trigger pull of 4.15 and double action trigger pull of 10.1. In comparison to our pre-work, that's a reduction in about 0.70 on each side. So we reduced the trigger weight by about 0.70, so 0.7 of a pound on each side. So next we're going to go ahead and replace the springs. Before we do that, talk about how the trigger feels now. After getting all that grit out of the trigger, smoothing the components out, and doing a lot of stonework with it, it feels a lot better. That sticking point that was there before is gone. The grit is gone. So the pieces and components that we're going to be replacing, so they sent us a new sear and a new hammer. I did a lot of work on that sear and hammer. I honestly don't like the finish of either this sear or hammer. They look like direct factory replacements, nothing competition grade or at a higher level. So we're going to leave our original sear and hammer in place, but we are going to do a spring replacement, and we'll see where that gets. We finished with replacing the springs, performing a trigger job on here. I don't know if I'm the only one or if it was a standard. I did not get a new sear spring with this kit, but everything else I did get that I needed to replace. So the spring for the magazine release, the spring for the trigger, and the hammer spring were all replaced. So the firearm is free and clear of any ammunition, no feed source, and it's been visually and physically inspected. So the new trigger pull on this, after our last measurements, came out to 3.3 pounds in single action and 8.6 pounds in double action. So that's an overall reduction. That's an overall reduction from our original weight of about 1.5 pounds on single action and 2.2 pounds in double action. So let's talk about feel. So, I'm not gonna lie to anybody, I'm not a fan of this firearm whatsoever, even after a trigger job. It feels cheap, it feels chintzy, it does not feel like something that I would ever trust my life to. The trigger on it, while it is a very light trigger now with that 3.5 pounds, I can still feel the upward rise of, and this is even in single action, the upward rise of the slide as the trigger is pulled to the rear. In double action, it is still very clear in appearance. For me, the break is not crisp. The polishing done did help it a lot. It was extremely, extremely bad. This is still not a good trigger for me. I'm not a fan. Will never be a fan. The firearm as a whole feels like it's from Temu. So, that's just my opinion. The trigger job it worked as it was supposed to. It reduced weight, it removed the grit, it removed the sticking feeling, but the feeling of that actual slide rising as I pull the trigger is not going away, and that's going to be because of those two double hooks that slide up into the slide as that trigger bar is pulled. To assess what we did, number one, got an initial trigger pull. Next, we disassembled the firearm, looked for areas that were either in need of smoothing due to machining marks, or if there was areas of high contact where we had started to see the finish on the metal rub. What we did from there was, using our stone set, just ever so slightly take a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time until we achieved that smooth surface where we were seeing an even removal of Dicam across the entire surface. The next thing that we did was ensure that the firearm was operating safely. So, it was not pictured, but we wanted to ensure that the firearm would operate safely. So we wanted to ensure that drop safety was functioning. So, to do so, just start with a hammer lock to the rear, pull the trigger, while holding pressure on the hammer, slightly release the hammer forward and ensure it catches on that secondary sear. So the other thing that I do on any drop test that I'm going to do is simulate a drop. And I'm going to take a non-marring hammer, so a rawhide mallet, and orient the weapon, of course, in a safe direction, and just apply shock to the back of that frame, to the back of the hammer, everywhere I can. That would simulate a drop. I will also go to the front of the firearm to simulate the drop. And as you can see, we're striking it pretty hard. Again, make sure if you're doing this, you're using a non-marring hammer. And still, the hammer did not fall forward without the pull of the trigger. So, where there are several things that I'm not a fan about of the firearm, its ability to resist a drop fire is actually pretty good. Even after a trigger job where, again, I didn't remove much material, just smoothed out the surfaces overall, but still, it's risky. So, especially with the 3.5 trigger pound, we're getting a lot of forward motion. 3.5 pound trigger pull, we could see that that trigger or disengage the sear. So that didn't happen. So for part 3 of the assignment, I need to reflect on how confident I feel in performing this work. So I feel very confident. This is now the 3rd, 4th firearm that I had to do this very similar trigger job on for the school assignments, but beyond that, I've done it on some of my own firearms. Would I do this type of work? No. Am I prepared to? Yes. The reason I say no is I've now reduced this trigger from the 4.8 pounds down to 3.3 pounds, and in most ranges, other than competition and serious professionals, that's going to be potentially considered an unsafe trigger pull. So we want a weight of about 4.5 pounds. Double action, the double action could drop down to an even 8 and would be fine. But talking about that single action trigger pull, I would not want to do that for a customer and put my liability on it. Now replacing it with a factory trigger, or not a factory trigger, but an aftermarket trigger, instead of doing the work myself, I'm about that. They purchased it, I installed it. So, but doing trigger jobs is not going to be something my business will offer regularly and possibly at all.
Resources for the assignment were from Sonoran Desert Institute FTH Module 3, Hammer Fire Diagnosis, Detailed Measurements and Repair, and then Sonoran Desert Institute FTH 223 Module 4, Hammer Fired Handgun Customization.